Greetings, and welcome to another session of Ask the Pastor Bible Study Live. My name is Steve Magua, and I welcome you to this broadcast, this session. We are going to be discussing this topic that I've put here, and I know it's a long one. Young Earth, Old Earth, Creationism, Seventh-day Adventism, fundamentalism, liberalism, and you. So I'm going to wait a few moments here so that a few of my friends can join. Welcome, Megs. Good to see you. Karibu. How are you, my friend? Can you tag one or two people as you come in, my friends? And we shall soon start our broadcast here. We shall soon start our broadcast. Let me tag a few people that like to enjoy this broadcast with me. So I am going to wait just a few moments before I begin, at least to get a few people in. While I am doing that, let me go ahead and tag a few people. Now, this one is, this broadcast is only going forth on Facebook because the StreamYard program is not working right. And so I'm not able to do YouTube and Facebook at the same time. So we'll just go about it like that for now until we see something different. All right. Let me see if I can find my friend here. There we go. Very good. So, thank you, Megs. Thank you, Megs, for sharing that. Hopefully, let me make sure that it is actually going public. Yeah, it is going public. Very good. So I want to discuss a topic here that I think is of great importance to all of us. And so, for instance, if I was to ask you today, how has the church always believed with reference to the age of the earth vis-a-vis Genesis chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3? What has been the fundamental position of the church for the last 2,000 years? Has it been a young earth or an old earth? What has the church been believing to this point? Now, what you might be surprised that if you ask most Christians today, they will say, no, the church has been believing that the earth was created 6,000 years ago for the last, almost 6,000 years. That's what it seems like. Growing up, I actually asked this question to my wife yesterday. I said, what do you believe the church always taught concerning the age of the earth? And she said, well, we grew up knowing that the earth was created 6,000 years ago, right? And that was the fundamental position of every denomination, at least where we came from. And so it seems as if that's what the church has always taught, right? Today in 2024, the dominant view in the church is that if you don't believe that the earth is only 6,000 years old and that the earth was created in 6 24-hour days, then you are pretty much a heretic. And even if not a heretic, you are on the very fringe of Christian belief. You are not a fundamentalist. So this is what is generally believed by most Christians today. But the question is, what is the actual history? What has the church been believing? By the way, good to see you, my friends. Sam Karaoke, welcome. Brother Randall Nas, man, you are such a resource, my good friend. Thank you so much for being here, all of you, and please hit that share button. So what I would like to do, I'm not going to waste too much of your time. I want to share with you an article that we are going to read together that will hopefully teach you something concerning what the church has been thinking about the age of the earth and how to interpret Genesis chapter number 1 and what the church has been doing since its inception and what the church is doing right now and why we do why we believe what we believe right now in general. Okay, so I'm going to bring in an article here, and this article comes from the book Beyond Creation Science, which is written by Tim Martin and J.L. Vaughn. Let me see if I'm able to do that. Hopefully I'm able to do that. Hold on one second. I thought I could do it. Give me 1 second, guys. If I can do it, I will do it. Hopefully I can. How do we do this? I've not done this on Facebook before, so this might be a new thing to me, but I'm hoping that I can actually be able to put my page on here. Well, it doesn't seem like I'm able to do it, at least from where I am. When I was testing it, I thought I could, but it doesn't seem like I'm able to do it. But anyway, this is what I'm going to do. Since you can see me, I am going to share this article with you because I have it on my computer here, and then we will discuss it. So I'll just go through a couple of things. Now, this is going to be found in Beyond Creation Science, which you can get for free. It's a book. It's actually a solid book, but you can get it as a PDF for free at www.beyondcreationscience.com. Okay, so let me just begin reading it, and then hopefully as I do that, we'll be able to learn together. So this is how it goes. This is chapter number 6, and it says liberalism and the fundamentalism context of the young earth, old earth creation context. Now, the rise of young earth creationism among conservative Christians is a part of the wider debate between liberalism and fundamentalism. Liberalism gained traction in mainline seminaries and churches as a direct result of the prevailing higher criticism popular in Europe during the second half of the 19th century. Liberals concluded that there is nothing supernatural about the Bible. So they denied divine inspiration. They also denied miracles such as the virgin birth and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Because of their bias against all things supernatural, they also embraced Darwinian evolution. So this is in the second half of the 19th century. In other words, late 1800s. Okay, so there was a lot of because during the Enlightenment period, there was a lot of what was called higher criticism, and liberals began to believe that the Bible is not a supernatural book. There are no miracles, and so on and so forth. And so they, at the same time, Darwin had come out with the evolution theory, and so liberals kind of leaned towards that side. Now, the reaction against liberalism in America came to be known as fundamentalism, a term coined as a result of the 1909 manifesto edited by a theologian called R.A. Torrey, which was titled The Fundamentals. So in other words, whenever you hear somebody say, I'm a fundamentalist, fundamentalism was coined in the 1900s. So in other words, when you go back, let's say, to Martin Luther, or you go back to Augustine, or you go back to Irenaeus, people never called themselves liberals or fundamentals. These are things that have just happened within the last 200 years, actually less than 200 years. So anyway, the movement that is fundamentalism defended the divine nature and inspiration of the Bible, as well as miracles. In response to liberal claims, fundamentalists made literal Bible interpretation the central tenet of their theology. This strategy defended all biblical miracles against the new liberalism's inherent naturalism. But it also produced a key side effect. Fundamentalism became synonymous with dispensational premillennialism because it championed a literal approach to prophecy. Remember that when you are a dispensationalist, a premillennialist, one of the key tenets of interpretation is that the Bible must be taken literally. Everything you see in the Bible must be taken on the surface value. And so obviously you can see how when the fundamentalists began to push back against the liberals, and they said that the fundamental tenet of the fundamentalist theology is literal interpretation, that actually merged with what dispensationalists were saying. So anyway, the last of the original 5 fundamental doctrines in R.A. Torrey's book was belief in Christ's personal, premillennial, and imminent second coming. The fundamentals have become different for various groups of conservatives, but the liberal versus fundamentalist controversy polarized methods by which Christians came to interpret Genesis. The fundamentalists' pre-commitment to literalism created the necessary conditions for a widespread acceptance of young earth creationism. But that common explanation is only a broad outline to understand why young earth creationism grew to dominate conservative views of Genesis. Remember that right now in the 21st century, it is almost considered the fundamental principle of interpreting Genesis to be a young earth creationist. In other words, if you don't believe that the earth is 6,000 years old, and if you don't believe that the earth was created in 6 24-hour days, you are considered to be on the very edge of heresy, if not totally heretical. So there is much more to this story. Dispensational premillennialism set the bulk of conservative fundamentalist Christians in America onto a collision course with Lyell's old earth geology. Now, let's talk about the view that was dominant in Christianity before the 19th century. The battle between Lyell's, so Lyell was a geologist, he's a scientist. So Lyell's geology and Darby's theology did not begin immediately. The Plymouth Brethren, founders of modern dispensational premillennialism, had no qualms over an ancient earth in the 19th century. This act Henry Morris in their book that was written in 1961, which we'll mention a little bit later. But this is what Henry Morris said in 1961. The smaller fundamentalist churches, such as the so-called Plymouth Brethren and various independent churches, for the most part, retreated to the gap theory, inserting the geological ages in an imaginary gap between the first 2 verses of Genesis. Now, hopefully, my dear viewer, you have heard of the gap theory. Now, let me tell you what it is in short. The gap theory is, and it was believed quite much in Christians before the 19th century, was that between Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, and Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, that there was a gap of time that was thousands and even maybe millions of years of time. I don't know if you've ever heard about this. So there are people who said, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Then when you go to verse 2, it says, the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. So God only creates that which is perfect, they reasoned. And therefore, the fact that the earth was formless and void in verse number 2 meant that there must have been something that happened in order to destroy the earth. And this could have spanned thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of years. So this is what Henry Mollis says, that most of the smaller fundamentalist churches, like the Plymouth Brethren, which by the way came up with the rapture theology as you know it today, they taught that Genesis had a gap between verse 1 and verse 2 of Genesis 1. Now, the reason the 19th century dispensationalists accepted an ancient earth is very simple. The idea of an ancient earth was the dominant, if not the universal belief among Christians at the time. Even long before Charles Darwin, the dominant view, in fact, almost the universal view of Christians, was that the earth was very old. So before the 19th century, that argument was not there that the earth is young. Now, Darby's personal friend, a guy called C.I. Scofield, whom you might have heard of, later popularized dispensational premillennialism, what we now call the rapture doctrine, in America with the 1909 publication of the Scofield Reference Bible. Scofield Study Bible incorporated the gap theory of creation in a note on Genesis chapter 1. Quote, this is what Scofield wrote. Now remember, these are the rapture doctrine founders in the early 1900s, late 1800s. This is what he said. About the statement without form or void, compare it with Jeremiah 4:23-27, and compare it with Isaiah 24, verse 1, Isaiah 45:18. Clearly, and I'm quoting Scofield Bible reference, clearly this indicates that the earth had undergone a cataclysmic change as a result of divine judgment. The face of the earth bears everywhere the marks of such a catastrophe. These are not wanting imitations which connect it with the previous testing and fall of angels. You can see Ezekiel 28:12 from verse 12 to verse 15, Isaiah 14:9-14, which certainly goes beyond the kings of Tyre and Babylon. So that's what Mr. Scofield put in his reference Bible, that the earth was showing evidence that it was very old and that it had suffered some catastrophic judgments from God, which happened between verse 1 of Genesis 1 and verse 2 of Genesis chapter 1. So this was the dominant view in the 19th century and before. Christians in the 19th century who did not accept the gap theory generally held to the day-age interpretation of the creation week. Mark Knoll, Wheaton College McManus Professor of Christian Thought, references this oddity in light of current views of creation held by conservatives. Quote, despite widespread impressions to the contrary, young earth creationism was not a traditional belief of 19th century conservative Protestants or even of early 20th century fundamentalists. So right now, in other words, you are in 2024, and it seems for most of us, like for me, when I grew up, in every church I ever went to, in every place I was brought up in, young earth creationism was the standard teaching. But in the 19th century and in the early 20th century, it was not a widespread teaching. People are not teaching that in the churches. Now, the widespread popularity of young earth creationism today conceals the fact that very few believed in a literal 24-hour day creation of the universe and a young earth from some time in the 1700s to a few decades ago. That explains why J. Vernon McGee, the late J. Vernon McGee, who died in 1988, the stalwart Bible teacher whose messages beamed from millions of radios across America for much of the 20th century, could state his old earth views quite plainly. This is what J. Vernon McGee said, quote, The first 11 chapters of Genesis cover a minimum time span of 2,000 years. Actually, 2,000 years plus. I feel that it is safe to say that they may cover several 100,000 years. I believe this first section of Genesis can cover any time in the past that you may need to fit into your particular theory. And the chances are that you would come short of it even then. So this is a quotation by J. Vernon McGee. He lived between 1904 and 1988. He's a very well-known Bible teacher. I remember watching him as a kid. So he said the first 11 chapters of Genesis cover more than 2,000 years. Right. Now, he continues to say, who created the universe? God did. He created it out of nothing. When? I don't know. Nobody else knows. Now, remember, this is still a quotation from J. Vernon McGee. So he says, when did God create the universe? I don't know. Nobody else knows. Some men say 1 billion years ago. Some say 2 billion years ago. Some say even 5 billion years ago. I personally suspect they are all pikers. I think God created it long before that. End of quote. So J. Vernon McGee, a very popular Bible teacher in the up to 1988, plainly stated what most Christians believed during the first part of the 20th century and before the 19th century. The earth was old. Young earth creationism is a modern development. It took time for the implications of Darby's new prophetic views to work their way back to the book of Genesis. The dominant old earth creationist views of the 18th and the 19th century Christians did not lose their status among Christians overnight. Now, by the way, just for those of you who are joining, I am reading from chapter 6 of Beyond Creation Science, written by my good friend Tim Martin and J.L. Vaughan. Tim Martin is actually one of our speakers at the August conference. So you can get this book free of charge on PDF at beyondcreationscience.com. So let me continue here. So young earth creationism is a modern development. To believe that the earth is young is something very modern. It is not something that was believed by Christians over the last 2,000 years. The dominant old earth creationist views of the 18th and 19th century Christians did not lose their status among Christians overnight. At the time of the Scopes trial in 1925, only a handful of Christians in America seriously believed our universe was merely a few thousand years old. William Jennings Bryan, who lived between 1860 and 1925, a champion of young earth creationists today, believed that our earth and our universe was millions, if not billions of years old. He recognized, as countless Christians before him, that the real enemy is atheistic Darwinism, not a conception of the age of the earth that exceeds 10,000 years. Noel sums up the situation at the time of the Scopes trial in 1925. Quote, popular opponents of evolution in the 1920s, like William Jennings Bryan, had no difficulty accepting an ancient earth. Bryan, and you can hear he's an opponent of evolution, Bryan, with an acuity that his patronizers rarely perceive, so clearly that the greatest problem with evolution was not the practice of science, but the metaphysical naturalism and consequent social Darwinism that scientific evolution was often called upon to justify. End of quote. Gary North, another historian who differs with Noel on many points, concedes that young earth creationism was intellectually dead at the time of the Scopes trial. He says, quote, and this is now Gary North, Bryan was not a six-day creationist because in 1922, there weren't any six-day creationists in the Protestant religion. My goodness. Listen to that again. This is a quote from Gary North concerning William Jennings Bryan. He says, Bryan was not a six-day creationist because in 1922, there weren't any six-day creationists in the Protestant religion. Now think about that for a moment, guys, before I continue with this quote. You grew up, and I grew up, being taught that the 6-day creation, like 6 days, 6 24-hour days creation in Genesis, there has never been another view, that this has always been the Christian view. But these guys are telling us in 1922, while our grandfathers were still alive, while some of your parents were already living, there were no 6-day creationists in the Protestant religion. There was one guy, continuing with the quote, there was only one guy anyone had heard of who held the position, and that man was a man called by the name George McCready Price. So we are about to enter into where does Seventh-day Adventism enter into this question? Because you might have wondered, why did I add Seventh-day Adventism into the title of my video? So there was only one guy anyone had ever heard of at 1922 who held the position that God created the earth in 6 days, 6 24-hour days, and his name was George McCready Price. Now, Brian's bitter opponent during the Scopes trial, Clarence Darrow, thought he could capitalize on Brian's well-known old earth views. He assaulted Brian with questions about his understanding of Genesis 1. Brian responded with his famous statement, "The Rock of Ages is more important than the age of rocks." He believed that the age of the earth to be irrelevant in the debate over evolution. Brian's statement was not controversial at the time. The only one who raised the issue of the age of the earth was George McCready Price. Henry Morris claims Price confronted Brian about his old earth views before the Scopes trial. Morris writes, and I quote, "Probably the most serious mistake made by Brian on the stand was to insist repeatedly that he had implicit confidence in the infallibility of Scripture, but then to hedge on the geological question, relying on the day-age theory. He had been warned against this very thing by George McCready Price." Morris goes on to imply that Brian lost the case in the court of public opinion because of infidelity on this point. But who was George McCready Price, and why did he defend young earth creationism against all other conservative Christians in early 20th century? Why was he going against the flow of things? Everybody else was believing in an old earth. Who was George McCready Price? The reason goes all the way back to the Plymouth Brethren and the events of 1830. George McCready Price emphasized premillennialism and the imminent pre-tribulational rapture of the church. As a devout Seventh-day Adventist, Price also promoted Sabbath keeping, that is, worshiping on Saturday, the seventh day of the week. The Adventists insisted on a literal 24-hour reading of the days of Genesis 1 in order to provide a theological defense for their strict Sabbatarian views. I bet you most Christians in most evangelical churches do not even know where their fundamental views of Genesis 1 come from. But here it is. The Adventists, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, insisted on a literal 24-hour reading of the days of Genesis in order to provide a theological defense for their strict Sabbatarian views. These, combined with a global view of the Genesis flood, led the Adventists to stand against every other Christian denomination with their young earth creationists' views of Genesis. Adventist doctrine formed around the teachings of their chief prophetess, Ellen G. White, who lived between 1827 and 1915, whom they considered to be divinely inspired. Much like Margaret MacDonald's a few decades earlier, White had visions or trances where she would receive ostensibly God's revelation for the Adventist church. Many of these trances were directly related to the premillennial futurism of the sort the Plymouth Brethren introduced. However, White did not merely concern herself with visions of the rapture and the second coming of Christ. She also spoke at great length about the book of Genesis. In one of these revelations, which occurred sometime before 1864, Ellen G. White offers her vision of the flood event. Quote, before the flood, there were immense forests. So this is the vision that she saw. Before the flood, there were immense forests. The trees were many times larger than any trees which we now see. At the time of the flood, these forests were torn up or broken down and buried in the earth. In some places, large quantities of these immense trees were thrown together and covered with stones and earth by the commotions of the flood. They have since petrified and become coal, which accounts for the large coal beds which are now found. This coal has produced oil. White's conception of the flood event matched her dispensational premillennial views of prophecy. Noah's flood was a global cataclysmic event comparable to the supposed imminent Great Tribulation. Again, I quote her. The bowels of the earth were the Lord's arsenal, from which he drew forth the weapons he employed in the destruction of the old world. In the day of the Lord, just before the coming of Christ, God will send lightnings from heaven in his wrath, which will unite with fire in the earth. The mountains will burn like a furnace and will pour forth terrible streams of lava, destroying gardens and fields, villages and cities. The earth will be convulsed, and there will be dreadful eruptions and earthquakes everywhere. God will plague the wicked inhabitants of the earth until they are destroyed from off it. This is a quotation from Ellen G. White. And that's the end of the quotation. Now, White also suggests I'm hoping that my video is still continuing, and I think that it is. So let me continue here with my quotation here. So Ellen G. White suggests that the true scientific investigation would reveal the empirical evidence for Noah's flood in geology. Again, I quote her. Geology has been thought to contradict the literal interpretation of the Mosaic record of creation. It is true that remains found in the earth testify to the existence of men, animals, and plants much larger than any now known. These are regarded as proving the existence of vegetable and animal life prior to the time of the Mosaic record. But concerning these things, Bible history furnishes ample explanation. Before the flood, the development of vegetable and animal life was immeasurably superior to that which has since been known. At the flood, the surface of the earth was broken up, marked changes took place, and in the reformation of the earth's crust were preserved many evidences of the life previously existing. The vast forests buried in the earth at the time of the flood, and since the flood changed to coal, form the extensive coal fields and yield the supplies of oil that minister to our comfort and convenience today. These things, as they are brought to light, are so many witnesses mutely testifying to the truth of the word of God. End of quote from Ellen G. White. Now, George Macready Price forever put his mark upon the history of the Genesis debate when he set out to provide an academic defense for Ellen G. White's inspired visions. Remember that Seventh-day Adventists consider the visions of Ellen G. White to be inspired, just like the Bible. So, Knoll explains, quote, modern young earth creationism arose by contrast from the efforts of earnest Seventh-day Adventists who wanted to show that the sacred writings of Adventist founder Ellen G. White, who made much of a recent earth and a Noachian deluge, could provide a framework for studying the history of the earth. Especially important for this purpose was the Adventist theorist George Macready Price, who published a string of creationist works culminating in 1923 with the book The New Geology. That book argued that a simple or literal reading of early Genesis showed that God had created the world 6,000 to 8,000 years ago and had used the flood to construct the planet's geological past. Note how author Samuel Frost credits Adventism as the source of what has become the modern conservative view of Genesis. He says, my stepfather, rest in peace, was a Seventh-day Adventist. Say what you will about them. My dad was a godly man. Their work on Genesis is unprecedented. In other words, this was the first time this was ever done. Bernard Ram, a well-known Bible science author, had this to say about the situation in America as the 20th century unfolded. And I quote from Bernard Ram, now we shall pass on to the great revival of flood geology in the 20th century. This revival was carried on principally by the Seventh-day Adventist apologists and was termed the New Diluvialism or the New Catastrophism, to distinguish it from the older flood geology of Cuvier and Agassiz, theories of successive floods over the ancient past which explain geological layering. One of the strangest developments of the early part of the 20th century was that George McCready Price, a Seventh-day Adventist with very limited professional training, became American fundamentalism's leading apologist in the domain of geology. So he was not even a geologist. Even this had the most peculiar quirk, because most fundamentalists accepted the gap theory. That is, there is many thousands of years between verse 1 and verse 2 of Genesis 1. So most fundamentalists at the beginning of the 20th century accepted the gap theory as taught in the Scofield Bible, a theory which the Seventh-day Adventists vigorously reject. At any rate, the influence of Price is staggering. Covering the tracks. Now, John C. Whitcomb Jr. and Henry Morris initially attempted to hide the origin of the basic ideas and scientific arguments in their 1961 book, The Genesis Flood. They sensed denominational differences between Adventists and other evangelicals might reflect badly upon their view. So they did not want to acknowledge the intellectual source for their thesis. So remember that John Whitcomb and Henry Morris are evangelicals. They have come up with an idea in 1961 in which they are saying the earth was created in 6 days and it was about 6,000 years ago. But they did not reveal that they had gotten their idea from George McCready Price. They obscured their source. Author Don Stoner explains, quote, the connection to Price and the Adventists worried Whitcomb and Morris. Unfortunately, their actions reflected more concern with the outward appearance than with the substance. Fearing that Price's Adventist-tinted reputation might hinder the acceptance of their book, The Great Genesis Flood, Whitcomb and Morris tried to avoid any visible connection with Price. Although they left the substance of their arguments unchanged, they removed nearly every mention of Price's name from their book. This irritated many of Price's friends who felt Whitcomb and Morris had not given him sufficient credit for the intellectual debt they owed him. The Genesis Flood, as it has been variously described, is essentially an updated version of Price's New Geology, or a reissue of G.M. Price's views brought up to date. End of quote. The basic theory of flood geology found in the Genesis Flood ultimately derives from the visions of Ellen G. White. Yet, the Genesis Flood was presented to Christian conservatives as the first scholarly book on geological catastrophism. It became the foundation for the explosive growth of young earth creationism since its publication in 1961. Although Price is mentioned a handful of times in the 500-page tome, never, not once, did Whitcomb and Morris credit Price and the Adventists for the basic ideas of flood geology. Morris later confessed to the role Price played in his views. And I quote Morris, now this is much later. The most important creationist writer in the first half century, at least in my judgment, was a remarkable man by the name of George McCready Price. I first encountered his name in one of Harry Reamer's books, and thereupon looked upon his book, The New Geology, in the library at the Rice Institute, where I was teaching at the time. This was in early 1943, and it was a life-changing experience for me. I eventually acquired it and read most of his other books as well. Several other Adventist creationists published papers in the Naturalist and other Adventist publications as noted in the following chapter. Although the influence of most of them was largely limited to their own denomination, some, especially Price, have contributed quite significantly to the foundations of the modern young earth creationists revival. 23 years after the release of the Genesis flood, so we are talking about 1984, 23 years after the release of the Genesis flood, Morris apparently felt that he could reveal the role Price played in his work. By then, American evangelicals had swallowed the theory of young earth creationism hook, line, and sinker. They had swallowed something else too. The same dispensational premillennialism at the heart of Adventism, which also undergirds Price and Morris's work, had grown to dominate virtually all American evangelicalism. The first dispensational mega seller after the Scofield Bible was Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth, published in 1970. This was the same year Morris Institute of Creation Research opened its doors as the Creation Science Research Center. Hugh Ross, a vocal opponent of young earth creationism, explains the explosive growth of young earth creationism during this period. So remember, this is the 1970s. He says, quote, and this is Hugh Ross, by 1980, nearly every American evangelical church and school had been strongly influenced by the young universe creationist organizations and teachings. So pervasive has been the influence of such groups that their views on creation are thought to represent the doctrine of the entire community of Bible-believing Christians. Ross's analysis omits any reference to the connection between premillennialism and the young earth creationist movement. This oversight is understandable given the fact that Ross publicly endorses premillennialism. But there is no doubt that young earth creationism and premillennialism grew to dominate the American Christian scene simultaneously. There are few evangelical leaders whose views are a reverse image of Ross's views. While Ross accepts premillennialism and rejects young earth creationism, these leaders accept young earth creationism and reject premillennialism. It is a curious fact that these evangelical leaders never made progress in convincing the vocal proponents of young earth creationism to publicly renounce their prophetic views. Gary North, a noted post-millennial author, vented his frustration in this way, quote, "What has bothered me about the creation science movement for almost 2 decades is that its leaders will not admit that they have mixed together a particular view of eschatology that has nothing to do with the categories or content of physical science. They refuse to tell their followers this part of the essay is based on premillennialism, and the empirically verifiable facts of physical science don't have anything to do with it." North tenaciously defends young earth creationism, but objects to the prophetic views held by all the leading young earth creation authors. What North and other anti-dispensationalists do not seem to consider is the possibility that dispensational premillennialism lies at the very heart of modern young earth creationism. Let me try and put this in simple words. In other words, dispensationalism, the teaching about the rapture, is the core foundation of believing in a young earth, because both come from the same source and both are saying the same thing. So this lapse seems strange considering the fact that North fully understands who made the Genesis flood a blockbuster success. Speaking of Whitcomb and Morris's famous book, he notes, Moody Press turned down the manuscript because the Genesis flood was hostile to age-day creationism. They said, "We won't publish it." Boy, was Charles Craig happy? He was my publisher. 2, was he happy? First bestseller he ever had. He was now selling to Baptists. Ooh, boy, there's money. These were the same Baptists who had become dominated totally by dispensational premillennialism. That's why they loved the Genesis flood. In other words, if you look at the Baptist denomination today, they are probably the most ardent supporters and even advancers of the rapture doctrine. You know, people like John MacArthur and so on and so forth. They loved the Genesis flood because both things were based on the same foundation, and I would say very shaky foundation. So premillennialism applied to Genesis. For George MacReady Price, the issue was not only about a literal 24-hour reading of Genesis, of creation days to justify Sabbatarianism. The issue in Genesis was much larger for him. His work on Genesis was interwoven with his own prophetic views. What he attempted with flood geology, what we now call young earth creationism, was a self-conscious application of his premillennial beliefs back to Genesis. In 1922, before premillennialism rose to the absolute dominance among American evangelicals, Price wrote the following: "The most timely truth for our day is a reform which will point this generation of evolutionists back to creation and to the worship of him who made the heaven and the earth. Other reforms in other days have been based upon various parts of the Bible here and there. The reform most needed in our day is one based on the first part of the Bible and upon the last part also. For he who is looking for the return of his Lord and for the imminent ushering in of the new heaven and earth must necessarily believe in the record of the first part of the Bible which tells of the creation of the earth. Surely it is useless to expect people to believe in the predictions given in the last chapters of the Bible if they do not believe in the record of the events described in its first chapters." Price never foresaw the smashing success his views would have or would become in modern day America. Today, conservatives generally accept his views of Genesis as well as his views of end time prophecy. But what his statement makes clear is that everything in the Genesis debate goes back one way or another to 1830. Price consciously worked out the premillennial implications for Genesis. When Lyell, the geologist, published his book, Geology, there was virtually no Christian opposition to an old earth, to an ancient earth. Vocal Christians were some of the most eminent geologists of that day. As dispensational premillennialism grew in popularity and influence, it gradually developed a new approach to Genesis. Victory for the Plymouth Brethren's dispensation of premillennialism meant that Lyell and other earlier geologists would inevitably become demonized as apostate. This is what the success of Darby's theology meant for the Genesis debate. Listen to this. Most flood geologists, in America at least, came from churches awaiting Christ's soon return to the earth. As for Christians expecting the imminent end of the present age, whether premillennial Baptists and Adventists or amillennial Lutherans and Church of Christ members, Whitcomb and Morris offered a compelling view of earth history framed by symmetrical catastrophic events and connected by a common hermeneutic. If you take Genesis literally, reasoned Morris, you are more inclined to take Revelation literally. Now listen to that thinking. In other words, if you want to convince people to take the book of Revelation literally, you need to convince them to take the book of Genesis literally. Now, of course, that is irrespective of the fact that the very beginning of Revelation tells you Revelation is not to be taken literally. Revelation is a series of symbolic visions, which are obviously allegorical, which are obviously apocalyptic. But if you want to convince people to ignore what John said in Revelation, convince them to take Genesis literally. Now that's the end of the quote, even atheistic evolutionists understand how modern young earth creationism is a function of premillennial futurism. Michael Ruse, the popular Darwinist proponent from Harvard, writes the following. For George McCready Price, this worldview was all bound up with the premillennialism of the Adventists. The flood at the beginning corresponds to the forthcoming great tribulation at the end. End of quote. The same could be said about the overwhelming majority of American conservatives during the last few decades. Premillennial philosophy of history. Now, premillennialism also provided another motivation to reject modern geology and science. We believe the compelling reason why Whitcomb and Morris embraced Price's flood geology is rooted in their literalism, prophetic views, and overarching philosophy of history. They viewed modern geology as anti-biblical because they saw evil uniformitarianism as proof of the arrival of the last days of the planet Earth. What biblical basis did they cite? Morris taught that 2 Peter 3 refers to cultural conditions made possible only by the rise of modern geology. He drew a link between Lyell's uniformitarianism and what Peter predicted regarding the last days scoffers described in 2 Peter chapter 3. Listen to what they said, quote, the basis of this scoffing rejection of God's word is their commitment to evolutionism. Since all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation, they will say, therefore, creation is still being accomplished by these natural processes that continue in the present just as they have throughout the past. This prophecy, 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 3 to 4, began to be fulfilled with the rise of Lyell Darwinian evolution worldview in the mid-19th century. Now listen to what Whitcomb and Morris wrote in 1961, that the prophecy of Peter, 2 Peter 3, began to be fulfilled with the rise of Lyell and Darwin evolutionary worldview in the mid-19th century. So in other words, Peter was writing about evolution. Peter was writing about what was going to be happening in the 19th century. Peter was not writing about what was happening in his day. Wow, listen to that. Morris, like Price and White before him, viewed modern scientific developments through his premillennial view of culture and society. From his prophetic viewpoint, modern science and culture are predestined to degenerate into apostasy during the last days before the rapture and the second coming of Christ. Morris believed he lived in the last days, and so he anticipated a great worldwide apostasy. Does that sound familiar? Lyell's geological uniformitarianism fit the bill for Morris's view of Peter's prophecy. American Christianity was not far behind. His message clicked with American audiences precisely because they shared his prophetic outlook and therefore his pessimism. J. Vernon McGee, the famous radio preacher that we talked about earlier, held to the common old earth view for decades during his early radio career. He even openly mocked the suggestion that the date of creation was around 4000 BC. You know, the one by Bishop Ussher. And this is a quote from J. Vernon McGee. In our day, there is so much misinformation in the minds of intelligent human beings. For example, before me is a clipping from a secular magazine from several years ago. It posed a question, then answered it. First, the question, what, according to biblical records, is the date of the creation of the world? Now listen to the answer that was given. 4004 BC. How utterly ridiculous can one be? End of quote. But later in his career, McGee came around to preach Morris's view. This is his later quote. The Genesis flood not only answers the question of its being a universal flood rather than a local flood, but it also answers this question of uniformitarianism. I am not going to go into detail except to point out that Peter makes it very clear that we should expect such scoffers. Knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lusts, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 3 to verse 4. The scoffer has always been a uniformitarian. Now remember, a uniformitarian is a geologist. So Peter is now being put in Peter's mouth that Peter was saying the scoffers are geologists and scientists. The scoffer has always been a uniformitarian, but you would not very well hold that position and accept the integrity of the word of God at this particular point. This is very important to see. End of quote from J. Vernon McGee. Millions of conservative Christians in America heard this on their radio from the beloved J. Vernon McGee. McGee's book referenced above is a compilation of edited transcripts drawn from his radio sermons. This little book, which likely stretches over decades of McGee's preaching, is perhaps the finest demonstration of the total shift away from the dominant old earth creationism once held in common by conservative Christians. This transformation in conservative Christian views of creation and science has taken place since the release of the Genesis flood in 1961. McGee's 200-page book promotes the gap theory of creation across its pages. At the same time, McGee lauds the newly released book by Whitcomb and Morris. These two things are incompatible. Now, quote, now this is from McGee. What is the scientific historical evidence of the flood? I am not going to enter into this subject other than to mention one of the finest books on this subject, which I can highly recommend. It is The Genesis Flood by Henry M. Morris and John C. Whitcomb. I assume there is an abundance of historical evidence for the flood, and it is not necessary for me to go into it, as it has been answered in this very scholarly book. End of quote from J. Vernon McGee. Consider the profound confusion. McGee expounded his gap theory view, which accepted Lyell's geology and old earth timeframe, and he endorsed the new flood geology, which defined the geological column in terms of Noah's flood and demands a recent creation simultaneously. This chaos can be explained only by a rolling paradigm shift in the second half of the 20th century. McGee's old earth views as a young Bible preacher eroded when the implications of premillennial futurism began to be applied back to Genesis. What McGee found compelling in Whitcomb and Morris's work was their shared premillennial philosophy, expressed in their common understanding of 2 Peter chapter 3, worked back into history. Young earth creationism's negative view of modern science is largely an effect of premillennial pessimism about the last days. Their analysis of modern old earth science as apostate and antichrist fits with their cultural worldview. The connection between young earth creationism and futurist prophetic interpretation is not a coincidental agreement in the overall outline of premillennial futurism. It is not merely chance compatibility between Baptists and Adventists as fundamentalist allies. The connection is deeply rooted in the absolute dedication to a particular method of biblical interpretation, a prophetic viewpoint, and philosophy of history. We think Noel is on the right track, but still only sees the tip of the issue when he writes, and I quote, a biblical literalism gaining strength since the 1870s has fueled both the intense concern for human origins and the end times. Literal readings of Genesis 1 to 3 find their counterpart in literal readings of Revelation 20, with its description of the 1,000-year reign of Christ. There may be even more to connect the earlier spread of dispensationalism with the later popularity of creation science. Creationism could, in fact, be called scientific dispensationalism, for creation scientists carry the same attitude towards catastrophe and the sharp break between eras into their science that dispensationalists see in the scriptures. End of quote. Dispensationalism eventually developed into a complete worldview, which modern young earth creationism became a key component. Premillennialism and young earth creationism. Now, Morris wrote his own futurist views in a 1983 book titled The Revelation Record. The real accomplishment along these lines, though, is when Morris combined his views on Genesis and prophecy in a remarkable 1991 book titled Creation and the Second Coming. The theme of that book can be found on the opening page of the foreword. Quote, "Why would a renowned creation scientist write a book on prophecy?" The answer is that while most such books focus solely on the future events, this one fits the future into God's program for original creation. A few pages later, Morris gives his testimony as a long-time devoted dispensational premillennialist. In other words, rapture believer. The signs have been increasing in clarity for many years now. I'm quoting. I remember my grandmother quoting an evangelist she had heard talking about Mussolini and other supposed signs of that day, predicting that Christ would return in 1933. When the atomic bomb exploded in Japan in 1945, even though I knew better than to set dates for Christ's coming, I was certain his return was so near that I almost decided not to go to graduate school. I have kept a plaque reading, "Perhaps Today," on my office wall for almost 50 years now. And I have noted that the signs which seemed so obvious 50 years ago have continued to grow in intensity with each passing year. Surely the Lord is coming soon. No doubt, many old earth creationists wish Morris had acted consistently with his premillennial beliefs by dropping his educational pursuits. But here is where the issues we covered in chapter 1 through chapter 4 of this book are crucial. Speaking of Matthew 24, verse 34 to verse 35, Morris writes, in this striking prophecy of Matthew 24, the words "this generation" has the emphasis of that generation. Now let me repeat that. Morris writes, in this striking prophecy, the words "this generation," quote, has the emphasis of that generation. That is, that generation, the one that sees the specific signs of his coming, will not completely pass away until he has returned to reign as king. Now, if the first sign was, as we have surmised, the First World War, so according to Morris, the first sign of Matthew 24 is the First World War. So if the first sign was, as we have surmised, the First World War, then followed by all his other signs, his coming must indeed be very near, even at the doors. There are only a few people still living from that generation. I myself was born just a month before the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918. Those who are old enough really to know about the First World War, that is the beginning of sorrows, would be at least in their 80s now. Thus, although we cannot be dogmatic, we could very well now be living in the very last days before the return of the Lord. End of quote. Morris is now dead, having attained the ripe old age of 87. His system lives on in large measure because of the power futurism wields over American evangelicals. But how much longer can this generation hold out? Let's talk about the contemporary dilemma. Others have argued against young earth creationism from different angles to mixed success. Given this historical overview, it is not hard to understand why young earth creationism seems impervious to criticism from old earth Christians. The reign of young earth creationism is inescapably tied to the reign of futurism among American Christians. So, in other words, so long as futurism is the trending view of American Christians, young earth creationism will continue to be the trending view of how they interpret Genesis. But in the future, when views will change, and they will, when all the system of futurism fails, then they will have to go back and reconsider Genesis. So this is just my commentary on this. So anyway, let's continue here with this article. This truth could be stated just as accurately in reverse. The reign of futurism is tied to the reign of young earth creationism. Consider this remarkable statement. Eschatologists, in other words, implicate their holders in a wide range of stances, including views of human origins. Perhaps the statement would just be as true if it were reversed. Old Earth creationists often wonder what it will take to bring about the demise of young Earth creationism, which they believe, scientifically speaking, is no stronger than the proverbial house of cards. Nevertheless, its popularity remains astonishingly high among American evangelicals. Conservative Christians who dare to question young Earth creationism are commonly accused of evolutionary compromise, liberalism, humanism, unbelief, and even apostasy. Old Earth creationists ask themselves why young Earth creationism seems bulletproof in the face of seemingly overwhelming physical evidence. Could the answer be that futurism predisposes Christians to young Earth creationism? There is also a small but growing group of conservative evangelicals who believe New Testament prophecy is focused on first century events in Rome and Judea. They also wonder what it will take to bring about the demise of dispensational premillennialism in America, which has retreated from reasoned biblical defense of the view. These preterists note how futurism's popular defense and exposition has been reduced to the publication of a sprawling set of popular novels, that is, the Left Behind series. Preterists lament how Christians endure failed prophecy after failed prophecy. For instance, the just past, eclipse with John Hagee. This is a sign of the rapture. A few years ago, 10 years ago, the blood moons. So this is just my side commentary. So preterists lament how Christians endure failed prophecy after failed prophecy. Futurists seem to never grow weary of speculating about the identity of the Antichrist from the time being upon the newest boogeyman in the headlines. Preterists ask why modern futurism seems bulletproof in the face of any rational evaluation. Could the answer be that young Earth creationism predisposes Christians towards futurism? Or could it be that a wooden literalism based on a modern understanding of the world predisposes Christians to both young Earth creationism in Genesis and dispensationalism in prophecy? The following pages of this book represent a multifaceted investigation into these questions. This book, Beyond Creation Science, is a comprehensive critique of young Earth creationism. As such, it will include a dimension we have never seen incorporated as an argument against young Earth creationism. Our presentation will center on what we believe to be the central error of young Earth creationism, that is, futurism. We will argue against the three pillars of modern young Earth creationism from the perspective of a preterist view of the New Testament prophecy. We believe that preterism offers a refutation of A, the belief that Genesis flood was a global flood. B, the belief that no biological death existed before the fall. C, the belief that Genesis 1 is a literal record of God's creation of the physical universe over 6 24-hour days. Our goal is to convince you that any critique of modern young Earth creationism that assumes prophetic futurism will be ineffective over the long run. In like manner, any critique of modern futurism that assumes young Earth creationism will also be just as ineffective. Only a holistic approach to the Bible from Genesis to Revelation can provide a coherent alternative to the popularity of young Earth creationism on one side of the Bible and dispensational premillennialism, rapture doctrine, that is, on the other. In the end, these two pillars will stand or fall together. So this has been a rendition of the book, the article by J.L. Vaughn and Tim Martin that comes from their very, very awesome book, Beyond Creation Science. I already said at the beginning of this broadcast that You can download a free copy of Beyond Creation Science at their website, www.beyondcreationscience.com. It is not a science book, but it is a book that seeks to refute both futurism and young earth creationism using the hermeneutic of the Bible to show that those views are actually incompatible with what the Bible is teaching. I hope that this has blessed you. I hope that this opens up questions in your mind, questions in your heart, things to look into, things to research, things to meditate upon. What does the Bible mean in Genesis 1? What does the Bible mean in Revelation? The whole of Revelation, but more particularly the last 3 chapters of Revelation, Revelation 20, 21, and 22. Is it what futurists tell us it is? Is what Genesis 1 is teaching, is that what young earth creationists are saying? Is that correct? Now remember that one of the things that I have highlighted in this article today is that the common view that the church has always believed in a young earth, and that the church has always believed in a 24-hour days creation, this is not held up by evidence. You can go back very early. You can go back to Irenaeus. Irenaeus did not believe in a creation that took 24-hour days. Justin Martyr, another church father from the 3rd century, 2nd century, did not believe it either. Augustine did not believe it either. Barnabas did not believe that either. Yet, you will be made to feel guilty if you believe that Genesis 1 is probably, right from just looking at the text, just superficially, is probably not talking about 24-hour days. I invite you and I encourage you and I admonish you to put a second pair of eyes on this issue. You can do it from many directions. You can just do a personal study. You can go on Google. You can do whatever you want. But I want to recommend this book. It has really helped me to crystallize the issues, to understand the issues, and to be able to make a good defense of what the Bible is teaching at the beginning of the Bible and what the Bible is teaching at the end of the Bible and in between. Now, this is not and has not been our regular Ask the Pastor programs in which I will do questions and answers, simply because the server that we use is not working right now, and so I'm not able to use my software that is able to put up all the scriptures and all that. So therefore, I will finish here, hoping that this has been a blessing for those of you who are watching live, and that this is a blessing for those of you who are watching this on a replay. Of course, you can always send me questions on my Facebook Messenger or on my WhatsApp. You can look at my earlier videos and you will see that information always scrolling at the bottom. I trust that we will continue to fellowship together in the name of the Lord. God bless you so much.